morning. Where's the German audience? Okay, so basically the whole room is German, but nevertheless I will still try to talk in English. I want to talk about two stories. And at the end of those stories, it will become apparent that Bitcoin is an engineered solution for a 5,000-year-old problem, and that Bitcoin as a solution is following the same pattern as all other major breakthrough in humanity. The first thing I want to talk to you about is a visit of mine to my former high school. A couple of months ago, I was invited to my former high school. The teacher heard about a book which I published about Bitcoin, and she wanted me to talk to the 12th graders about Bitcoin and about money. So I naturally came back to my hometown and visited my high school. And before we talked about Bitcoin, we wanted to lay the foundations of money so that we are all analyzing Bitcoin from the same base. So I told the students, in order to understand the foundations of money, you need to understand what are the three main things which we use money for. So I asked them, and they raised their hand, and they said, well, the first thing you can do with money is you can spend it. That's obvious. The second thing which you can do with money is you can invest it. And the third thing which you can do with money is you can save it. And I was quite impressed, because that was exactly the three things which I was alluding to. And then I asked, what are examples for all those three categories? And then they said, well, spending, easy. You can spend money on food, you can spend money on clothing, you can spend money on cars. Spending money is basically just consumption. What about investing? You can invest in stocks, you can invest in commodities. With investing, you're basically betting on the future of something else. And then I asked, what about saving? What are the vehicles which we use in order to save our money? And at first, the room was quiet. And then one girl raised her hand and she said, well, when I talk about saving, I basically always refer to the euro. And that is correct. If I would tell you that I have a lot of money saved up, you would intuitively infer that I have this money saved in euro. So then I asked, the euro is the basic form of savings in our culture. How does it serve us? How do we measure success in saving in euro? And then I elaborated and said, saving basically is the transportation of your purchasing power into the future. If I save now, I delay consumption in order to purchase something else to a later date, but in the equal amount or even in more amount than I can do it today. And how does the euro work if you have this in mind? And I think it's obvious for everybody in this room, but also everybody at home, that it doesn't work to save your money over a long period of time in euro. For my students, I used an example. I asked them, what is something which you would love to buy? And then one guy said, well, I would love to buy a Porsche. Like, okay, a Porsche is quite expensive, but imagine you were a bit older, and 70 years ago, when the first Porsche 911 was released, you would have had the decision. Should I buy the Porsche today, or should I save the equivalent money and buy the Porsche later? And the person who would have bought the Porsche back in 1970, he would have used 10,000 or the equivalent of 10,000 euros to buy the Porsche, and he would still be driving Porsche today. The other person who would have decided to save the equivalent of 10,000 euros, he would have saved the money in order to buy the Porsche later. And the later happened today, and today he decided, now I will finally use this money to buy a Porsche. So he walks to the dealership and says, I saved my money back in the day, and now I want to buy a Porsche for 10,000 euros. The dealership would say, well, for 10,000 euros, young man, you can get a color of a car, but you will never get a whole car. And even if you would have saved the 10,000 euros in a bank account with interest, you would have maximum gotten $40,000 to $50,000 or euros, which still doesn't suffice for a Porsche. And I think this story shows that saving your money in euro does not work if your goal is to delay consumption today to get the equal amount of consumption or even a greater amount of consumption in the future. Because saving in euro means you delay consumption today to get less consumption in the future. So the takeaway from this is the euro, or basically any other currency, is ideal for spending it, but it's miserable for saving it. So then I asked the students, is there an alternative? And after moments of silence, they said, yeah, gold is an alternative. Gold is not investing, gold is saving. The difference between saving and investing is if you invest, you speculate on the future of a company, of the future development of a company. When saving, you basically buy something which is there already, which has the properties already, and you just want to store your money. So they said, gold. Gold is a store of value. And then I asked why. Why gold? Because there's a lesson in this question. And the first guy said, well, gold is a very valuable metal. It is used in all electronics. It is used everywhere. The demand in the industry is very high, and therefore it is very good to store your value. And then I asked him, well, if it's about demand in an industry, why do we use gold to store our value instead of steel? There's way more demand for steel. Everywhere around us is steel, way more than there's gold. So why don't we store our money in steel? And then he raised his hand and he was like, well, storing your money in steel would be stupid because everybody can produce steel in unlimited amount. Steel is very prone to inflation. And then I asked, well, that is very close to the core. We don't use steel or copper or any other useful material to store money because they don't have the right properties to justify putting my money inside of those metals. Gold, on the other hand, is scarce. Gold, on the other hand, is very durable. And that justifies it to put my money into this metal to store my wealth over a long period of time. But is gold perfect? Without even thinking about it, the answer would most probably be no. And the answer would be no because gold wasn't created to store value. It has a few of the properties which we need to store value by chance, but it wasn't created to store value. So what are the properties which gold lacks? One property is it's scarce, but it's not limited. It is not clear how much gold we have. The second thing is gold is not very divisible. If I have a kilogram of gold and I wanted to send you 1 gram of gold, it would be very difficult to siphon off this 1 gram to give it to you. Gold is liquid, but not liquid enough. It's also not portable enough. It's very difficult for me to send gold to you back in the back row if you are somewhere in New York. It will be quite difficult to send it from me to you. So, although gold has some of the properties which we need to store value, it doesn't have all of the properties. Which is not surprising because gold wasn't created to store value. It just happened to be there, a product of an explosion of stars with a few properties which by chance justify storing money inside of it. My background is I'm a physicist. So as a physicist, you would look at this problem and see, well, what would an ideal store of value look like if gold isn't the ideal store of value? And the answer would be, well, it needs to be scarce as gold. Ideally, it should be limited. It should be durable. It should be liquid. It should be global. It should be censorship resistant. It should have zero cost of carry. I need to be able to store $5 in this asset, but I also want to store $5 billion in this asset without incurring more cost. It should be verifiable. I brought 1 gram of gold with me. Nobody of you knows if this is a real gram of gold. It could be some other metal with the same density of gold plated with gold around it. So it's very hard to verify if it's real gold, even if I would give it to you right now. So the ideal store of value should be verifiable, and easily so. And in my estimation, Bitcoin is this engineered, perfected solution for the store of value problem. Bitcoin has all of these properties ingrained in a protocol, decentralized so that these properties are guaranteed, and therefore Bitcoin symbolizes the unification of all the properties which you need to store your value in one single asset. And this is the first time where we have a solution for the store of value problem which was designed with the properties in mind. Until then, until we had Bitcoin, we basically improvised with otherworldly things which by chance happened to have a few of the properties. We improvised with seashells, we improvised with glass beads, we improvised with gold, we improvised with stocks, but none of them were created to store your value because none of them have the correct properties which justify it for you to put your money inside of it. And that, by the way, is the answer to the intrinsic value question of Bitcoin. Bitcoin itself doesn't have intrinsic value, but Bitcoin, everybody knows there is no such thing as intrinsic value, but that's another question. Bitcoin has intrinsic properties which justify it for me to put my value, my hard-earned money, into it, like a battery, to store it. And we see, if we look closely, that there is a pattern which repeated itself dozens of times over the course of humanity. A pattern of having a problem, and in the absence of an ideal solution, misusing otherworldly things until the engineer stepped in to create an ideal solution. Let me give you a few examples. One of the oldest problems of humanity was that we couldn't see when it was dark. Right now, this room is quite dark, but fortunately enough, we have electric lighting. But in the absence of electric lighting, we needed to use other things so that we could see in the dark. And mainly we used fire. We used torches, we used candles, we used fire pits to be able to see at night. It was a good solution, but it wasn't an ideal solution. It wasn't ideal because you have problems that you need to attend the fire 24/7 for it to burn. You need to be careful with the smoke development. But in the absence of an ideal solution, it was okay. Until the engineers stepped in, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and they created an ideal source of light, which is electrical light. And right now, nobody uses fire to light up a conference. We all use electrical light. And nobody of you uses fire to light up your home, maybe for the atmosphere, but not really for the purpose of seeing. We all use electrical light. And this pattern that we have a problem, since a century-old problem, a 1,000-year-old problem, and in the absence of an engineered solution, that we use something else which has a few of the properties but not all of the properties. Fire doesn't burn all the time, for example. Fire doesn't burn very far. This pattern, that then when in the future, an engineer steps in and creates the ideal solution, and the ideal solution is the reason why we don't use any fire anymore. Basically, all the other misused sources of light collapsed into electrical lighting. This pattern gets repeated all over the time. Same with communication. We misused people who were not designed to send messages over long distance of time. We misused smoke signs to send messages over long distance of time. We misused pigeons to send messages back home when we are on our way to fight a battle. Until an engineer stepped in, created the internet, and now we don't use pigeons, we don't use humans, we don't use smoke signs, we just use the internet to communicate. 99% of all communication goes over the internet because it's the ideal engineered solution for the communication problem. Electrical light is the ideal engineered solution for the lighting problem. The refrigerator is the ideal engineered solution for the cooling problem or the preservation problem of food. And Bitcoin is the ideal solution for the store of value problem. And now the question is, what about the volatility? Because that is the most often problem which people come with to me and say, well, you say Bitcoin is the ideal store of value. My ideal store of value shouldn't be volatile. And I say, well, that's true. But number one, volatility isn't something which is intrinsic. Volatility isn't an intrinsic property. Volatility is a consequence of how people interact with this asset. It has nothing to do with the properties of the asset. And second, Bitcoin is volatile, and I think rightly so. Because the problem of how do I store my value is one of the oldest problems which we have. It is a minimum of 5,000 years old as we started with the division of labor and as we introduced money into our society. And in the absence of an ideal solution, we had a lot of money in the search of an ideal store of value being placed somewhere else. And this market is $450 trillion big. And if you have a $450 trillion market which searches for an ideal engineered solution but doesn't have it yet, and then you introduce the ideal engineered solution, you have a potential difference of $450 trillion. And if this $450 trillion gets injected into this new solution, it will be volatile for the first couple of decades of the monetization phase of this store of value asset. How far can it go? If we look at the patterns of history, basically all engineered solutions sucked up all of the use cases for their specific purpose. We don't use anything else except electricity for lighting. We don't use anything else for cooling except for the refrigerator. We don't use anything else for sending messages over long distance of time at long distances except for the internet. And it is rational to say that somewhere between 10 and 90% of all the money which is just held to store value will be sooner or later injected into the ideal perfected solution, which is Bitcoin. And if we speak of 10%, we would have a Bitcoin price of around $2 million. If we speak of 90% in today's purchasing power, if we speak of 90%, we would have a Bitcoin price of $18 million in today's purchasing power. When will this be arrived? I don't know, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 30 years, maybe in 40 years. The number would be way higher because of inflation and everything, but the purchasing power would be somewhere between $2 million and $18 million. So in summary, because my time is up, it is the first time in the history of humanity where value has a home which is engineered rather than improvised. And Bitcoin is not just any other asset. Bitcoin marks the end of the search of the ideal store of value. Thank you.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.